But we will have audio?
No,
No.
we can't stream, but we can record.
We can record. Oh, I
Yeah,
see.
no,
Record
post it after
and
the
have,
meeting.
okay, good. Well, then let's call this meeting of the Curriculum Committee to order. We have the three people here. And do we have an approval of the agenda?
So moved.
Second.
And before we begin, we have a public comment. Would you like to come forward?
Sure. My name is Sarah Ryder. I am speaking on item 5A on the agenda. I am the parent who is requesting that my student be allowed to graduate after his, technical year of graduation. I appreciate the consideration that both Mr. Borowski and Mr. Gutenberg and Mr. Scheel have provided in this issue, and that you all are taking with our request. So it's not certainly a usual request probably for a family to ask for something for this. Our son's a junior this year. But we have looked at years both of our experience parenting him, observation of him, and then of course the unique situation of this year, which has really exacerbated some of the things that Luke presents, and so that's why we're coming before you with the request. So just a little bit of background on our son. He is very bright, very capable, very engaged student, always has been. We have needed to provide some support for more executive functioning skills with him, sort of always. Some of the time management skills, the ability to break things down into small steps, the ability to be problem solving, be proactive, draw connections into sort of larger projects, final exams, those sort of things have always been challenging for him. So since he's been in high school, we've gotten outside support for him through tutors and preparation for finals, things like that. But he really is sort of behind where we would expect him to be, especially going into his second semester of his junior year. And with everything going on with virtual learning, I think it's exacerbating those deficiencies, and he's falling further behind. So at this year's 4-week grading period, when the grades were published, he learned he was failing 2 classes. It was a surprise to him and a surprise to us. So that sort of was, what I understand, not totally a unique situation in this environment this year. I don't think he's in a situation where, he's in a, disadvantaged position, but more experience, more maturity, more practice is going to set him up for success, which is why, given everything going on this year, we thought this is the best solution for him. So, I welcome any questions.
Can I ask, is that okay if I ask a question?
Sure.
No. Is that?
Sure.
What is his plan for after high school?
So he has plans for college. He has high expectations for where he's looking to go to college, which again, given the situation that he had no final exams last semester, only pass-fail grades, which he passed, and he hasn't taken the ACT, took the PSAT this year. But again, it's just sort of that ability to breathe and practice and learn so that he really can set himself up to reach his potential and achieve what his goals are.
Thank you.
How does your son feel about it?
So we, yeah, Yeah.
We appreciate hearing from you, but, you know, is this something he's embracing with enthusiasm? Is he sort of reluctantly going along with it? Where's he at with that?
Yeah, great question, and I sort of wish I had brought him to let him share with you. He feels it's the right thing for him, and, you know, I think that gives him the opportunity where he can explore more academically and mature individually, and he's on board with that. He sees that in himself.
Are you suggesting another year?
That's what we would like.
Not a portion thereof, but another year?
I think that's the cleanest way, as I see it, to do it, where he has, you know, the ability to take classes. You know, one of the things that's great about Waunakee High School is there is such a plethora of classes available to them. You know, he has followed sort of the core curriculum well, but would be able to expand his experiences. And you know, he is taking, you know, he's taking 2 AP classes right now. You know, so he is pushing himself. But again, I think this gives him the opportunity to sort of experiment and try and fail in an environment where the stakes aren't as high.
Does he do any co-curriculars?
He does. We've encouraged him to get involved in clubs, which he's been hesitant to do his freshman year. He said, I just want to get the lay of the land. His sophomore year, he sort of pushed back. In his situation, to make things worse, we transferred him out of the district at the beginning of last year to a small private school where he'd get very small classes. It wasn't a great experience, and we brought him back in November. And so again, he sort of was, let me get resettled before getting involved in clubs. And then, of course, we went virtual. He's involved athletically both with the hockey and lacrosse.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Which brings us to agenda item 5.
Yeah.
And so there's 2 components to it, and you know you've heard Sarah provide some context for why in large part, not the only part, why 5A is on the agenda. Brian is here to provide a high school perspective on both. And Rebecca, just so we have it at hand, could you bring up the 345.4? So one thing we need to keep track of is, from a housekeeping perspective, these policies haven't been visited in a while, and it would be good for us just to kind of take a look at them comprehensively. But if we could go through down here to the high school piece a little bit. Right, and so here's what we have. So the way we're set up at the high school, and Mark and Joan, you may be familiar with this because you taught at the high school, and in fact, the last time this policy was revised, you were still teaching, I believe, in the high school. January 2002. So students, if they have credits, they get a grade placement, and then if they meet our graduation policy, they graduate. And then the promotion retention determination made at the building levels may be appealed, to the superintendent. And so, I think, there's 2 ways to look at this. One is as an individual piece, but I think the question that's coming up is a question we may hear additionally, and maybe not only at high school, but in other grades, which is, this has been a very disruptive, everybody's doing the best that we can, but education since March has been different. So as we consider these kinds of requests, I think as a board you need to keep in mind that if this door gets opened, And, you may feel there are individual cases that merit some consideration, but if the door gets opened, it's not impossible. There might be many requests that would come. And at some point, would have to consider, how we could resource a large number if that was indeed what the board, wanted to do. And I don't think it's the case necessarily in this particular student situation, but it certainly would be the case that other students could potentially look to use the early college option, and if they'd exhausted our course catalog, and in an additional year add on college credits through the state program before moving on. So that's a dimension as well. There's a lot of pieces here, but I think you're going to have potentially additional situations that may come up similar to this, where there's a student with a particular set of characteristics where what's happened in the last 6 months has presented some additional wrinkles and challenges, and then what's the appropriate educational response to that. But so you've got an individual case and a kind of larger set of questions under the policy. And Brian, I don't know if you want to add on to that at all, or
May I stay here?
You can come up to the table, Brian.
Okay.
Thank you.
And I appreciate Sarah coming and doing this too, and care about all kids. As Tim said, I worry that this would open us up and it would turn into an allocation issue. If it's one kid, that's one thing. If it's 20 or 30, that's something completely different. And if it's 150, then it's as far as the allocation changes that would take place, and the possible cost to the district could be immense. There's an athletic question. A student decides to redshirt their freshman year of sports and then decides to now have that extra year added on. So also, you would take the massive amount of AP classes and exhaust the curriculum, as Tim said, and that start college now. I mean, there's a financial aspect to this, and there's a lot to think about. And I do not disagree that this year's been disruptive like none other, and it is incredibly challenging for our kids, for our families. My concerns are our building is not getting bigger right now as far as space. If we have kids stay for an extra year, that's additional staffing, that's additional classes, it's additional cost. If we're talking about one student, that's an entirely different thing. And we do meet kids where they're at if they're not meeting the graduation requirements. We have kids currently this year that didn't meet it last year that are still working with us, that we're still trying to support. And just the whole process of adding possibly a small number of kids, could we deal with that? Possibly. If it turns into a larger group of kids or kids who are injured their junior, senior year, decide to have an extra year, they don't do athletics, they would have an extra year. So that would go into the next period of time. So, I mean, there are considerations that we have to think about, and my biggest concerns are the staffing for allocation and the space, if this would grow and get big. Yeah.
I do think it's germane to what we may end up doing. So in this particular case with Sarah's son, are there some academic concerns that he's probably going to fail a class or two, and those would need to be made up, or is there? And understand that he probably is not in that kind of a situation, but it's more just needs more academic support before he continues on to the next level.
If that question's for me.
Either way, I mean,
Okay.
yeah.
I bring that up more, not so much to say that we have a student who's now sort of crumbling. However, the environment of the virtual school and has not been necessarily helping him in a way that can keep him on track. And so what was alarming when we got that 4-week report was the stress that placed on him, and we and he had been engaged and didn't know this. And so we'd gone 4 weeks, sort of both parties, thinking things were going okay without being able to course correct. That sort of is, I guess, just a symptom of what the reality is with virtual school. Sure. And given that environment, it's not helping him to reinforce the skills that I think he needs to then take the next step.
So would you be foreseeing some repeat classes even though he passes them, or taking different classes and just working on the other skill sets?
My preference would be the latter. He was sort of forced in that situation to reach out to the teacher to come up with figure out how to solve the problem, which is uncomfortable, but he did. He's passing his classes now. So that was a blip, but I bring it up to show that that sort of has happened over this period of time to sort of further hold him back.
And I guess the other question is, and maybe this doesn't matter, but when you look at what happened when you found out, is it a matter that there's not the knowledge level needed at that point, or is it a matter that there's work that was missing that he was not aware was missing? Is this more of a completion thing than actually an understanding thing?
Some of it is a little bit combined.
Okay.
I would say it's probably 70% a completion issue, 30% a knowledge issue, and probably, I think if he were sitting next to me, he would say the same thing.
Thank you.
If I can just add a couple of things. I mean, one of the things I think we've had, and this is part of the challenge when you bring up the policy that Tim did, is it's really looking at kind of retention. And how do you retain a student? It's pretty that's not cut and dry. It's a difficult decision at any grade level. But at the high school, it seems to always be driven with the student coming back for a 5th year when they haven't hit the credit markers to graduate. And from talking to Brian and the parents, it seems as if he's on track to hit the credits to graduate. So that's not a credit deficiency issue. It's kind of a desire to meet some individual learning needs, which I certainly respect and understand. But speaking kind of in a global perspective, how do we then look at this with all of our students? And I think for me, the piece that it looks at is when you, can you just go back to the agenda, please, Rebecca? Thanks.
Yeah, you need a back button.
Yep.
Yeah, the early, I wanted to use the right term, the early college credit program, that's dictated to us by law. We have to allow students who take, and then that's what you consider on an annual basis when those come forward, as far as kids who've exhausted classes can then come here and take additional classes that we pay for college. It just opens a very large door if we have college, if we have students who have met the requirements for graduation, who continue on for a 5th year. It really opens the door to us being required by law to pay for classes at the college level. So this is kind of separate from what your request is, but it's my concern on a global level as far as how that would impact us potentially with other students who may want to take advantage of additional time in high school, and then we end up being part of the funding mechanism for their first year of college. And I know that's not what you're asking and what you're referring to, but that's why Tim has that in the notes, because I think that's truly a concern, that as far as how do we navigate that piece with the needs of the kids.
I just have had, it's interesting this comes up now because I've had two parents not in this district wanting their kids to repeat an elementary grade that they're in now. They just feel like they're not making the benchmarks. And so I know there's a feeling out there that kids aren't getting what they thought they would be getting this year on different levels. And these people weren't in this district, but it just made me think, oh, where's the plus and minus of that? So this is good to see what we're looking at, what doors we're opening when we do this.
It's really complex. You know, you hate to take this off the table, because I think there are situations where, in the uniqueness of this pandemic, kids do not have the same preparation they would have had. But I also respect the complexity of what it would do to the whole system. Mark?
I see the merit of Mrs. Reinert's request. But I also see the boomerang effect that could have financially. And I don't know if it's sustainable, but in the same breath, it's possible we can make a single decision without changing the policies, and we support the policy.
Mm-hmm.
And that we treat each case individually.
Right.
I don't know at what point we'd have to how many times we'd have to revisit that. But I think it's such a important decision, both for the Reinhardt family and for our district, that I would like to move it to the full board for their discussion and their determination without a vote here, because right now I don't think I'm ready to make a vote on it. And with that being said, Mrs. Reiner, I can't assure you anything's going to happen positively at the next level, even if we did support it 100% in curriculum, because of some of the other arguments made in terms of the district's responsibilities to all the kids in the equity piece.
I am wondering if there is consideration to even opening this door, but only for this time because of the pandemic. You know, we have the referendum money. If there is a financial cost, if we have to have additional staffing, if we, can we contain it to a period of time where we might have funding to help us out without changing the policy, making it a case by case. We don't, open the floodgates. We deal with each case individually, and if it does escalate, we do have that referendum money for 5 years, and there may be some extra cost, because what Judy said about those younger grades, I've also heard that. I don't think it's going to be, I think our requests are just starting.
And that's aside from Sarah and the rest of her family bringing this forward now. That's yet another reason we wanted to get this in front of you. Was this is probably the front edge of additional requests, and as Brian has said, and I think you've heard it, also from Randy and me, accommodating one or a handful of requests this way is one thing.
Yep.
If it becomes a large number, again, depending on some variables, but the more that this would occur, there would be an unavoidable financial impact. And that's only talking about high school. Were it to extend into the lower grades, we're adding a kindergarten class every year. If you had, picking a number, 10 or 15% of the kids stay in place, that those kids need teachers. I mean, we're not going to expand our class, at least I would recommend, we would not expand our class sizes by 10 or 15%. So we would need to think about facilities issues. We would need to think about staffing issues. So an important question is kind of what's the larger piece, and then also is, would this be more of a one-at-a-time review, in which case that's potentially going to create a lot of work for somebody or somebodies, and then what would be the parameters that the board would want to see? This is a very complex question, but it's one we're going to hear.
Well, I would like to remind us that this isn't our first request.
Right, we had that 8th grader.
Mm-hmm.
We've had, how many kids pause kindergarten this year?
How many kids did pause kindergarten this year?
Do we have some?
I mean, occasionally we'll have kids who choose to do another year for pay, but that is not any more than normally would have.
But I think it is fair to say, going forward, we might hear requests of this nature, which would then have an impact. But I don't think we've had any. I don't think we've had any retentions from last spring beyond that one 8th grade transfer in. But prospectively,
If we treat this on a case-by-case basis and we follow our policy is retention. And the retention process is extremely time-intensive for the elementary levels of school psychologists, special teachers. And so I am worried about this becoming pretty unwieldy quickly.
So there is a policy for retention that's very stringent.
this is the policy we're looking at is our retention policy.
Yeah.
We started it in January. There's monthly meetings, there's observations,
Yeah, bring it back.
there's tests, there's data collection.
I think there's a number of things to look at curricular-wise, and Tim and Amy can fill in if I misspeak here. When I look at elementary and our lower grades, our curriculum is cyclical. I mean, there's pieces and concepts that continue to come back year by year. So granted that there may be pieces that aren't maybe taught in the same manner either last spring or right now, but they're coming back, and they continue to come back as we do that. I think that's a piece to be thinking about when you look at the retention pieces, is that we can continue to try to move some of those. They don't miss concepts and they never see them again. You get to high school, you start to get into more specific classes. Now the number of kids that are going to want to go into a 5th year of school is probably relatively small. They love Brian, but I'm not sure they want to spend another year with you. So I'm not sure to the degree that people would want to do that. Obviously the request in front of us is with a family and a student who would like to do that. So you're truly projecting at the high school how large that end number is going to be. But that's how I kind of look at the whole piece, because I've heard the discussion about retention and kind of what's being taught or not being taught. Elementary-wise, certainly all of it concerns me, but I do believe that some of these concepts do continue to come back at that level. High school, it's very specific, and our policy is driven by credits. So this is really a question, if somebody has met the credits for graduation, do we allow them to go and continue based on some individually determined criteria? And then how does that play into then their ability to tap into some of the college credit pieces? So I mean, those are the things I think we have to consider as we look forward.
I guess I'm wondering too, when you're looking at the grading system, like say in elementary, the concepts come back, but in the high school level, you have a continuum of how much you've learned or how you've graded, and unless you fail, you have learned something and you're ready to go on to for the next class, so.
But I disagree with that. If you're in an Algebra 1 class and you pass it, that doesn't mean you have enough content to go on to the next to advanced algebra. It just does not mean that.
And
And
we've allowed
it was-
kids to retake a class, I believe, at different times, even when they've passed it. Is that accurate?
They can, just
They-
not for credit, but not for grade improvement.
Okay.
Well, that's why I guess I was asking the question with Mrs. Fonte's son is, we've had kids who have passed tests with high scores, but because of all the preliminary work leading into it, their grade was significantly lower than the test score. So we're looking at two different things then. If we're looking at, is there a lack of, do they have the knowledge even though the score is low and they passed, or do they not have the knowledge because of whatever got in the way? And I think that's a critical piece of maybe deciding some of these things, that no two students are going to be the same with that. If it's a matter of, I didn't get X, Y, and Z work in, but I still aced the test, my grade still could be a C minus, but I know the content. And so if I know the content, why shouldn't I move on? On the other hand, if the test were to show that the knowledge is not where it needs to be successful, go to the next level, then I think there's a case to be made for it. I mean, those are two different situations. And then there's a piece, I don't even know what the culture is today. I know in the past there were prep schools for some kids who weren't quite ready to move to the next level. And I don't know if those things even exist today as an option. If you've met your requirements for the high school, but you still don't feel you're quite ready for the next level, you take a year at a prep school before you go to the next level. People have done that for both academic and athletic purposes. But I don't know what's there for them. So I do have the concern about how do we say no to the next student based upon, what criteria do we use to say yes? What criteria do we use to say no? And on the surface, this seems very worthy. If it were the only one, I'd say, well, I'm all for it. I don't know where I am right now. For the kids' sake, I would like to see it happen. For the district's sake, I think we need a criteria to make that decision.
And to be clear, administratively, we're not looking, and I know you all know this, is we're not looking for ways to say no for the sake of saying no. But our concerns are that if this went up to scale, even with the passage of the referendum, because $2 million is a lot of money, but in the context of our budget, it's not a huge percentage. And so if this went to a significant scale, could we resource it in a way that would protect all of our children's education? And also, if we were to want to extend additional flexibility, what would be our approval process? How could we make sure that it was both consistent and just in terms of a staffing, equitable to the students and families who are applying to it, but also something that we could really resource from a review perspective. I mean, as Amy mentioned, if this were to go down into the lower grades, a retention committee involves, multiple members, and that's just at the early stage. And then if it goes, further on, typically Kurt would be involved and a psychologist. It's not, now again, this is the policy we have. It's not to say we couldn't streamline these practices if that's what you wanted to do, but this opens up quite a few important questions.
Well, but you see, and that's even the difference. So if you look at the elementary for certain, I haven't skimmed through the middle school, but you do have a review process by the professionals in place making a recommendation based upon these things that they came up with. And no matter what we do in this particular situation, without changing the policy, any student has the right to go through this process. And so, but there's a process. My concern here, we don't have a process.
And I would
I think
argue
we-
the
I
process,
think we do.
the process is the credit bearer.
Yeah.
Right, I mean, that's exactly right, the credits are there,
There's no process for individual review, I think.
but there's no process for individual review, and because of that, we don't know, like Joan pointed out, is the students' knowledge of whatever math class they're taking now sufficient to move, they pass, but is it sufficient to succeed in calculus, if that's the next step? You know, what tells us that? We just see he or she would have the credit. At least at the elementary level, we have a process to help determine the readiness for the next level. And without that, it seems we're just guessing, is it a good thing or not?
What you're saying, Mark, you would have to make that determination for every kid that graduates, though, based on what you just said.
Yeah.
We would have to make an assessment, sit down, is this kid ready to graduate, even though they have the 24 credits? Are they ready?
I don't think so,
next-
Brian.
next
This
aspect?
doesn't happen for every grade school kid. It happens to the kid who's being considered for retention.
I was just listening in the high school.
And so at the high school level, it would seem to me to be the same thing. This would be, well, no, because the grade determines it.
The grade I mean, that's the piece, because when the kids that we're interacting with at the high school for the equivalency of retention are the ones that are credit deficient.
See, if we had, what's Miss Reiner's kid or any kid, if we had the guidance counselor, the math teacher, whatever teachers are in the current classes, looking at this situation, say, yeah, we agree, this is something that student needs because she isn't ready to go on. Now we've got something to make our decision with. But we don't have that. What we have is a passing grade. And that grade doesn't tell me, he's got the writing skills, the math skills.
But is the question to go on to what? Is it our obligation to get everybody to the same level when they graduate?
If the student had the potential to be there pre-pandemic, I would say probably yes.
And how do you determine that?
Or even pre-pandemic. If a kid has the academic skill, but it's not coming out for whatever learning hurdle they couldn't get over, that option for appeal should probably be there. Unless we're saying, send them to a prep school, which we can do. It's beyond our responsibility. I mean, we can say that. The thing that bothers me is that we're being asked to make a decision and we don't know. Because there's nothing to tell us except the grade. He passed.
Yeah, it's kind of like high school is being determined by seat time in some regards instead of readiness. And when we have a request to look at it deeper in readiness, how do we do that? I mean, we don't have a mechanism to look at, to me, a much more important criteria than seat count for being ready to go on. And I would really, I mean, I don't want to throw work at anybody, but I really would like to keep this on the table for a case by case. If they come forward, especially right now, you know, after the pandemic and we're back in session. You know, I also know we don't all get redos in life, and sometimes you have to live with the consequences of your actions and what you chose to do in a given situation. I think that this is not something anybody chose, and it's so unique. I think we owe it to the kids to address the readiness and the content that they have acquired during this time.
I like the caveat of the pandemic and do we need to do more for that?
Yes.
But I really question making school responsible for the, I don't know how to say that, the deepness of the education that the student gets here.
I agree, the whole redo process.
Yep.
Sometimes you only get to do it once.
I think there's so many factors that go into the education that a student gets out of being in the seat, that it would be very hard for us to have a policy that would enable the variances that might be coming up. So I say let's bring it to the board and let's really put that caveat of pandemic, but the school can't solve the pandemic issues. I mean, we're looking at food shortages for kids, we're looking at attendance, mental health. All of a sudden, we're trying to solve everything in the school administration for all the vagaries of this pandemic. So let's see what we can do, but I worry we take out too much.
So I think what I'm hearing is a desire to have this come to the, and I think that's the 12th, Randy? The December 12th board meeting. And when we do that, based on your conversation today as a committee, what information do you think would be beneficial to have in board book? And what are your thoughts on what information during the actual agenda item at the meeting really we need to make sure is presented to the full board? Bearing in mind that you three have one characteristic in common, all three of you are retired educators. Two of you are retired educators from our system, so you have some contextual knowledge that is not shared by all of your colleagues as well. So, I mean, is there anything that,
Well, I think for the benefit of the board, if it be at all possible to have a review team of some sort of his current teachers, counselors, for this particular student, to get a sense of,
But then you're putting it in a closed session, and this is
in a closed
just-
session, not an open
This
session.
is a very specific case, not a philosophy or
That would have to
moving
be,
forward.
yes.
We're looking at one case.
It's kind of like we did one earlier, did that in closed session.
Uh-huh.
Because for this one case, to make a decision, I think the board needs more information than we had today too. We have a
and
great
more information
petition.
than you can have in an open session,
What's that?
and probably more information you can have in an open session.
Right.
Yeah.
What
So-
we could do is we could do it in closed session to take up the family's request. That's very specific, and then it can answer some of those specific questions. If there's a desire from there for there to be further investigation, then we can take it up on a broader level as a board. That's more of an open session, or it goes to another committee.
Yeah.
But the reason it's in front of us is because of a very specific request, so we could address that and then see if there's broader interest in wanting to move it in a different direction for further conversation.
Do you think your son would be willing to come?
Yes, I do.
Or would? Okay. I think that would help if we could have an opportunity for him to speak to us and to the whole board about his desire, and maybe Brian. And if there is an academic area that you really feel he hasn't gained the content. Math is I was a math teacher, so I go back to math because it's such a progression of content. If you don't know one level, even if you get put in the next level and you squeak by, it isn't going to prepare you for anything. If there's an academic area that you feel he definitely is struggling in and needs this extra time to have the skills he needs to move forward, that might be a teacher that we could tap. I don't think we need a big barrage of teachers here.
No.
I really think, your testimony and your son's testimony are what we mostly need, unless you think there's an academic area specifically that might help.
Okay. Perhaps we
You can
can
just
coordinate
talk to
with
Brian.
Brian. Yeah.
Okay.
We would do this in closed session, so it's not recorded and it's not open to the public.
He did
So
not.
it would just be, there's no
What?
recording going on, it would be in this room just
He
with
did
part
not
of the
do
administration of the
He did
board.
a PSA.
Okay.
PSAs.
I
That
think
way
that's
the-
what
the
she
privacy-
Because
said.
he's a junior, so the ACC would be coming up.
Okay, it would be in the spring, he would do ASAP.
Okay, so that's where we are.
I think that's where we are on 5A.
Thank you.
Thank you, Sarah.
Thank
Thank
you,
you.
Sarah.
So 5B is also about flexibility in response to COVID, and I'm going to hand this over to Brian to speak with more, but if you could bring up the policy, and I'll show you where we're looking at. Thank you, Rebecca. I'll show you where we're looking at on policy. In our graduation policy, we have language, all students must take a minimum of 6 periods of classes per semester, while juniors and seniors in a student work experience or co-op program are to take a minimum of 5 periods of classes per semester. Only in special cases, with the counselor or coordinator approval, will students be allowed to take less than the normal load. And as you probably know, as we look at bringing us into hybrid session, spacing and density is an issue. And Brian, I think, has some very good reasons for us to look at this a little differently for the short term, but I'll let him speak to it.
Going in a completely opposite direction than what we just did.
What honor.
I don't know if we go down
Less
this.
is more.
We don't know if we go down this path, but so for seniors, and a lot of schools have done this in the area, in the state, in the country, is to allow, if their senior has 2 classes to take, and that's all they need for graduation, they filled their course load with things they were semi-interested in or, interest areas, but now they would prefer just to take, if they could, just take 2 courses and get the credits and graduate and move on. We always like a little buffer in there for kids, but in case they would fail something. But some of our kids are never really in doubt of failing classes, so if they need 2 courses, that they take the 2 courses and then they're done. And that would be it. Because right now I'm getting these requests all the time. I would prefer to have the latitude to just say, for this semester only, we can drop below. We didn't do this last year. We kept everything. But for this semester, the coming semester, if we're having students in the building, this would truly help decrease some of our numbers for specifically junior and senior courses to pull them down and make sure that we have enough space in classrooms.
And we feel this goes beyond the special case language, because we're not talking about special cases of individuals. We're talking more about the challenges of the pandemic being a special case. And again, like Brian says, he's getting a lot of requests. It's not the 1 or 2.
So when you get a request from the kid, is the parent involved in that?
Yeah,
Okay.
always.
Right.
They're part of it unless they're not in the home anymore. I mean, that's happening sometimes too. But it's always a family decision. Same as graduating early. That's a parent conversation and a student conversation. What's your plan? And making sure that they have a plan in place if they choose to graduate early.
Well, and from the logistics, it's not costing us space, staffing, or money to let them go early. It's just, those are the things that are removed from this equation.
And it's actually parallel to our early graduation request options.
Yeah.
And given the benefit because of the pandemic, I would say short term is a reasonable deviation from the policy.
And can we make it a short term?
Yeah,
Yeah, just with this.
I mean, there's already some flexibility. I mean,
Right.
By the language, there's already some flexibility
already
for
there.
Brian in the policy. It's just the need this year seems to be more extensive than how we've traditionally viewed the language.
Well, I think we could make it a temporary practice upon review after the fact. If it's something we want to pursue again going down the road.
You're just looking at the second paragraph there, right, Brian?
Yeah,
Yeah.
Yeah, I think it could just be a clarification where all we have to say is the special cases is considered during this COVID time and have the board understand what we're doing.
Yeah.
Sure.
Yeah, I don't think this
It may
needs to
just
go
be
through a
point
policy
to bring it
process.
forward,
Just-
bring this policy forward and say, we're recommending that we apply the special cases clause
COVID.
to this. And just make sure
I
everybody
agree.
understands
Everybody
it and is
good.
comfortable with it.
Good idea.
So I move to that effect.
Second. All right. See, we're easy.
yeah, that was straightforward, that makes sense.
You're batting 500 today.
I'll take it.
So, item 6, you'll remember we came to you in the fall with our fall with our assessment schedule, and we said, you know, this is pretty much, in most respects, what we did last year. Just understand, we expect to learn a lot in the fall. So we promised you that we would come back and let you know how the fall went. And then I just want to foreshadow some things. I guess I would say foreshadow the landscape for spring assessment. And there's some fog on that landscape. But I would say for first, just to speak to what we did this fall. And so maybe let's start with the lower grades and move up.
Sure, I like chronological. For 4K through 2, we did do our PALS assessment. That's how we fulfill the state literacy screener requirement. And the publisher did have different protocols for remote administration and materials to support that. So whether the students were in-person, hybrid, or remote, they all received the PALS. It was, a little more time-consuming for the remote teachers. They had to set up a kind of a one-on-one time and do that assessment. But they didn't need any additional technology. It was just via Zoom. We feel like our results are pretty accurate for that, even though we had the remote administration. It's hard to compare to the previous year, though, because there was a sub-test that we did not administer this year because of the how they adjusted the requirements. So I can't quite compare apples to apples score-wise, but in general, we believe it's pretty comparable, and we feel like they're fairly reliable. So then for K-6, we usually do a reading assessment of running records using the benchmark assessment system, the BAS. So that publisher did not have any accommodations for remote administration, so we looked for an alternate this year, and we used the literacy footprints. And we use a lot of their books, which we really like, and so we thought this might be a good substitute. It is not as robust as the BAS. It takes a little less time, but then also it doesn't give us quite as much information. And it's really hard. We can't really draw the parallel between the levels. So it gave teachers good formative information. They heard the kids read. They could identify teaching points based on that, but we didn't collect that for system-wide data because it just wasn't the same as BAS.
So how, whether we're talking the stars or the bells?
I haven't gotten to STAR yet, but
Okay, I'm sorry. But, so with those, regardless of those levels up to the intermediate, so how did the test results affect determination for need for reinforced support? Whether it's reading, speech language, that sort of thing.
do you mean like additional intervention, or do you mean?
Right. So, I mean, they gave a benchmark, and the families found out, okay, this is how they scored in X, Y, and Z area. But in terms of were students then identified based upon that for needing additional support, a different kind of support?
Sure. So each year, 3 times a year, we do universal meetings, we would call them. And so each grade level team would look at many pieces of data. We look at, these report cards, we look at classroom assessments, we look at these sorts of assessments, and then kind of identify who might be in the greatest need of intervention with one of our math or reading interventionists, things like that. So yes, we use this as a piece of data for that. That's what you're asking.
Okay.
Does that answer your question?
For the time being.
Okay. Feel free to ask a follow-up. So that was the literacy footprints for BAS. And then we also did the STAR, which many of you know is a computerized adaptive assessment. And we did that for 2nd through 6th grade for literacy and math. And we did that also for remote or hybrid. And the results for this are kind of mixed. Some of the schools had more technical difficulties than others. We had quite a few anecdotal reports of the remote kids kind of getting help from family members, even though we tried to communicate that it was an assessment. So we aren't necessarily sure of the validity of these for all students. And again, the upper levels, like intermediate, was very smooth. At the elementary, some buildings had an easier time than others, and we aren't really sure why that is, because when we looked at the back end, it felt like everything was set up similarly, but still some buildings had more difficulty than others. So that's just kind of a brief summary of the 4K through 6 assessments.
And do you have a question for?
I do, in terms of how the communication came out. We didn't have a plethora, but we got at least a couple letters of concern about delayed communications as to when the test score came out and when the parents were made aware of it. And so I don't know if that was misinformation we received or if there were some communication snafus in terms of Pels were finished, let's say, week 4, and I know that's not it, but
right.
Some parents didn't hear about it
Yeah.
till week 6 or 8
Yeah.
or 10 or whatever.
So I don't feel like our timeline was that different than in the past. I mean, it's never the case where you get it the day
The next
after
day.
the assessment.
Oh,
Here we did line it up with the supply pickup dates. So if you were in person, we sent it in the backpack, but if you were remote, we had it in your packet for your pickup date. And so we did have to look ahead, okay, when is the next pickup date, and then we'll send it home. So,
Okay.
but I don't think that was huge. I mean, maybe a week, because we do those fairly frequently.
Sure.
It didn't, I don't think it was much delayed
I appreciate
than in the
your
past.
And for the middle school, we used the Aspire, which we've done for a few years. That was a computer-based assessment. It was delivered at home. There have been a few changes in terms of how Aspire's packaged their results, so we're about a week behind getting the results back to families. But the only concern I heard from a parent about Aspire results, we were still in the middle of testing, so it wasn't going to be something that they would have received at that point. And we had pretty well communicated out the timeline. Now, in terms of how it went, technically it went very well. We do have about 40 students who were not opted out but didn't complete all of the assessments, and we kind of reached the point where we felt it was not productive to keep checking in with them and their parents. It was just something that was not going to happen with the students being at home. And it's a situation where if indeed, we get many of our students back in the hybrid program, if we have testing windows later in the year, we'll try to, connect in those 40 kids that we didn't get a response from. But that does mean that we had just a little under 600 kids who did complete the Aspire. And our results had some differences, but are actually very similar to previous years, which was a positive thing. The other large-scale administration we did at the secondary level was the World Language Assessment we used primarily at the high school, which is the Apple. And that involves speaking and listening and all of that. And again, we had really good experiences with the home technology. Now, it was self-proctored, but again, these are not younger kids. We feel pretty confident parents were not assisting their student in the older grades at all with these types of things. So we're pleasantly pleased with the technology. And so, I think, by and large, I think the world language teachers felt they got good information. The one thing we would sometimes run into, similar to the Aspire, is there would be some students, fewer at the high school, that we would have to check in with to make sure they were completing the assessment. But in the end, it's not how we prefer to administer these assessments. And we did have, at least at the middle school, some kids not complete, but it was less than 10%. I think all things considered, it was successful. We did hold off on both from administering them right at the start of the year, just because we wanted time for a few things to happen, for kids to get a little more acclimatized remotely with their teachers. And, quite frankly, our IT staff was working very hard at the start of the year, and we didn't want to, we wanted to provide kind of that acclimation time at the start of the year for relationship development for teachers and kids. We also didn't want to swamp our IT staff in case we had some challenges, which thankfully we didn't, but we didn't know that at the time. So I would say the fall piece went better than expected. I mean, some of our peer districts in the county have run their assessments. There are other districts in the county that have not run any assessment program at all this year so far. So, we feel pretty good. We feel we got useful information out of it. However, looking ahead, what we have done this fall was all local assessment. Now, the PALS is a state requirement, but the PALS is not a particularly high stakes. PALS doesn't affect our report card scores or anything like that. As of today, we do have spring testing for the state to think about, which is the ACT in early March. And Brian and I are meeting with Megan Bunkelman, who's our counselor who coordinates ACT testing at the high school, on Friday. And we're going to talk about paper and pencil versus online. Online is now an option for the ACT. But with the ACT, online, because of the high stakes nature of the test, means online but in school, not online at home. But online gives you the advantage of being able to get it done over a few days versus one day. And I think, we know paper and pencil testing very well. That's an argument for doing it paper and pencil. But when we think about getting it all done in one day, in one sitting with 6-foot distancing, that's something we'll be talking about on Fridays operationally, which we're more comfortable with. But then forward testing for grades 3 through 8, state Aspire testing for grades 9 through 10. As of today, those are all on the table. And
On the table by who?
it's in law. So what happened last year was as partly a matter of state law and partly a matter of federal law. So last spring, the Federal Education Department provided states with a waiver from the federal testing requirements. And as part of the initial state COVID relief bill that passed early in the pandemic, state assessments were waived too. Now, the assessments that are controlled by the state law are social studies in 4, 8, and 10, plus the 9th and 10th grade Aspire. Those are covered by state law. and only the state legislature, signed by the governor, can waive that. Now, you may have seen in the news that Governor Evers has proposed this week a COVID relief package, and that does include a second year of holiday from the assessments and the report cards. But that's not an area for executive action. The legislature will have to also be willing to participate in that. The federal government controls ELA and mathematics testing in grades 3 through 8 plus once in high school, which for us is the Ford exam and the ACT, plus science once per each level, which for us means 4th grade science, 8th grade science, and science on the ACT. That's something that the administration will have to decide. The current administration signaled this year there are going to be no waivers for assessments in the spring. If, as it appears is going to be the case, we have a Biden administration, it's unknown what they will want to do. There is a school of thought that flexibility would be helpful for schools. There's also a school of thought in the incoming administration, as I understand it, secondhand from our OSA representatives, is that there's also a desire to find out where kids stand and what kind of additional investments need to be made in schools the next few years to catch kids up. And so how those policy debates sold out at the federal level will affect 3 through 8 plus the ACT. But for us, if we're in hybrid session in the spring, whatever grades are in hybrid session, we would be able to test kids when they're in school. Now, if it's a grade level that just recently returned to school in the hybrid, and one of the first things they get to do is, instead of having instruction, instead take a fair amount of time for assessments, I don't think that's going to be popular with teachers or families, but those would be requirements that we would have to carry out. But I think we will probably hear about that. And I'm skeptical, even though we would offer a very nice invitation, I'm personally skeptical that a family who's decided to opt their child and keep them at home for virtual instruction will want them to come on site just to take the state assessment. I could be wrong there. I mean, the allure of the state assessment might be greater than I think it is. But so I think if we don't get flexibility on the state assessments, it's going to be a very complicated spring assessment season, because I think we will have fewer willing participants, and I think it's going to present some additional challenges for our hardworking principals who are already pretty extended, because we're going to have to think about how many kids can we have at a certain time to take the assessments, and think about our testing windows with some complications we haven't had to think about in the past. So, on the other hand, our kids are really accustomed to technology now, and most of our assessments are technology-based, and if we decide on Friday the online ACTs for us, then the ACT would also be technology-based. But I just kind of wanted to, put that out in front of you. I will say that, as a board, you may have a perspective on the desirability of either giving assessments, the state assessments, to our students in the spring or not. The governor is proposing legislation. If you as a board have a position on it, it's always, something you entertain from time to time to engage legislators with the board's perspective on whether something's useful policy or not. So, but the ACTs in March, that's really out of the state government's hands. But forward testing, some of the testing begins in late March into April, that is in the state's hands, and we're sitting here in November. It will be here before we know it. Mark?
Tim, something that has been fairly strided in my ear is, I think, just the worry that despite all the hard work everyone's putting into the education in the district, that there's a underlying fear that their individual kids are falling behind. And so is there, in terms of the testing piece, I think that's one thing that provides a comparison to kids around the state. And so in lieu of state testing, if that doesn't happen, is there something we can provide that assurance that our kids are doing okay despite, we see their resilience, we see they're working hard, we see their grades, but I think they're just somehow the assurance that they're in a good spot academically, skill-wise, despite all the challenges they're facing. How do we get that to the parents?
So the first thing I would say, and again, as a parent, I would say, like we as educators, you are not comparing. You're certainly not comparing a Macintosh to a Macintosh. Now, whether it's apples and oranges or a Macintosh to a Granny Smith, I can't tell you. But the star delivered in school to the star taken by the student at home, the 7th and 8th grade Aspire taken in school last year compared to the 7th and 8th grade Aspire taken at home, there's a difference there. But the STAR reports that our parents receive and the Aspire reports they're about to receive will carry a national percentile rank. So parents will be able to see, based on the percentile rank, how their child compares in those terms, to kids traditionally. Now, hopefully, parents are well aware of their students' testing environment. So if the percentile rank is low and they know their kid did their best, that might be a cause for concern. If the percentile rank is low and they know their student just wasn't super motivated to take the assessment, concern level is probably a lot less. Likewise, if your kid had a very high percentile rank, but you were very closely proctoring them during the assessment, you might not want to get, too excited about that, depending on what kind of hints and assistance you gave them. But I guess to answer your question, Mark, everybody is getting that report from grades 2 through 8. Either they've got it or they're about to get it. And I think, the elementary report card, teachers give a lot of descriptive information, in the report card, and we have conferences where teachers can respond to questions, how is my child doing? And our teachers, I think, are pretty good about letting parents know how they see their students' progress and are they on track. High school's a little different, but we had conferences in October. We'll have them again in March. We are not in a pass-fail system this year. We are giving our traditional letter grades. There's information in that. And I will say even if, for whatever reason, the federal government gives us an ACT waiver, a lot of kids are going to take the ACT regardless for admissions. There are more colleges and universities, about 500 more have gone test optional this year than in the past because of the disruptions of the pandemic, but a lot of kids will take the ACT. So we've got information about that, and certainly something we haven't shared with you, but we could bring it into a future meeting, and we've had more time to look at it ourselves, is to look at how this fall's assessment data at kind of a high level compares to last fall's assessment
That would be
data.
helpful, I think, for the board and for the community.
Yeah.
We've been so busy at the board with triage, with the pandemic, I know people are saying, don't you guys ever talk about curriculum? And we don't right now. And so that may give some assurances if we can find a time, down the road. I think that'd be helpful information.
Yeah, that's certainly something, we're looking forward to doing. But again, as an individual family, STAR or Aspire reports do give you that assessment snapshot for your child.
Thank you.
Okay. And we're on to British Lit.
And so this is really just an information item. This is not a new course proposal. This is just more of a housekeeping issue, but because it affects course titles we want you to be aware of it, and, Brian and I can answer any questions, but this is, traditionally, we had a lot of AP courses that, while in many schools they would be a 2-semester course, we would actually have the course titled AP as a semester course, and then there'd be a locally titled course that would basically be married with it, that kids would take together. Years ago, our AP biology students took a trio of courses that was anatomy and physiology, biotech, and a semester-length AP biology. We moved that to a more typical 2-semester AP biology a few years ago. For us, the AP language and composition course is a conventional 2-semester course. When that was proposed almost a decade ago, it came in as a 2-semester course. AP literature and composition, up till now, has always been a semester course for us, but any student taking Lit and Comp always took Grit Lit. And those combined really covered the full annual AP curriculum, but one was a locally titled course and one was AP Lit and Comp. Last year, the College Board made some changes to advanced placement where they provided a lot of supplemental materials that were available on a course basis to students that were enrolled in the course. And those are actually some pretty helpful materials. Technically, because a Grit Lit student is not taking an AP class, those kids can't access the AP resources until the second semester when they're in Lit and Comp. And what we would like to do is simply make the Grit Lit, without making any significant amendments to the actual course, the first semester of AP Lit and Comp, so then we can have our students access these supplemental resources the entire year instead of only the second semester. So, not a new course. What the kids are getting next year won't be a lot different than what they're getting this year, but it allows access to some useful resources in the first semester. That's pretty much it.
Makes sense.
Okay.
I don't think it requires board action, but usually when we make a change like this, we want you at the committee level to be aware of it.
Sounds good.
I appreciate that.
Thank you. So, we're at the bottom. We need some things that we'd like for next time.
I've heard assessment results.
I don't know if there's any way to address, Mark brought it up and we've heard it in the public comments, the whole content. And I'm not sure what kind of information besides those standardized assessments, if there's any way we can assess what content is being delivered in comparison to what was delivered.
Because of COVID, you mean?
Yeah. Too many people, I feel, equate content to time. Direct instruction time, and that's been reduced in half, and so they feel the content is reduced in half, and I'm not sure how to address that with the public.
So what
But
you're
I'm sure
asking-
you can, Tim.
Well, I think you mean
And
you
I'm
haven't
sorry, Brian.
sent all of the hot emails my way yet, Joan? Or there's some you've been holding out on?
You don't get all the nasty grams, Con, you must.
I'm not asking for more. I think we could. We can speak to it administratively. I almost feel like that might be an occasion where we might want to draw on some of our instructional leaders,
And that's
who are
what I wonder.
teachers, to talk about how.
For example,
Yeah.
we do the virtual, and so you've got, let's say, 70 minutes of visual contact for the course.
Mhm.
But I know even at the first grade level that what our grandson does on the screen, there's additional learning that goes from the same area beyond that.
Exactly. Yeah.
And so somehow that could just be explained, I think both to the board and the public in a fairly, if there is, in a simple way as possible, so that they just understand that 70 minutes isn't the end of the learning experience. That there are learning activities going on above and beyond. And I would assume the higher through the system you go, there could be some, as I've heard from a teacher, that the enriched work that kids are doing in preparation for coming together in their Zoom sessions. And that's learning. But and that it's not busy work, it's learning work. But that's, if there's a way to quantify some of that
It
and
just
explain
seems we should advertise or promote what is happening educationally to our public. And we have a great audience with the board meetings now. I mean, they are watched by, I mean, that's like
Millions.
Monday night, it's almost like Monday night football, Monday night board meetings. But I think we need to start promoting what's going on with our academic world to help everybody understand all the work that our educators are doing and really what their kids are getting out of it. And it isn't just 45 minutes instead of 90 minutes. And they're comparing things that have nothing to do with what they're getting.
And I think, you know, it is very, I mean, it's different for all of us. I mean, it's very different for our teachers too. So I mean, and I think when people experience something very different, they try to look on the things that look familiar to them and anchor themselves on those and draw conclusions from that. And so, you know, I think first of all, there are ways for teachers to really redesign courses to rely a lot less on the interaction. I mean, if a student were taking a truly online course through a virtual charter school, they would actually have way less, in most cases, much less video conferencing time than our kids have. Our kids get actually a lot more interactive instruction than you would traditionally see in a virtual course. Yet, prior to this year, I don't think anybody said that virtual courses, I mean, there's a question of match and fit, but I don't think anybody said virtual courses were not valid. And I think the other thing, and we can think about the best way to kind of present this in a way that gets more of a platform, is, you know, so the Zoom time is the interactive piece. Most of our teachers are also recording presentational material that you might normally do as part of your lesson. They record it ahead of time for the student to see outside of the Zoom. I mean, why take up Zoom time for an activity that you can record and ask the student to review outside of the interactive time? Right. And then you have the more project-based activities too. And so, but I think it'd be good to bring some of our teachers in to talk about how they present that in their courses. You know, it just makes it much more vivid.
Yeah.
And how they use the Wednesday time.
Yeah.
For individual support. We heard a ton of that last night
Absolutely.
from Arboretum.
And
how valued they find that.
We need to start letting the public know what's happening to help them understand where their child is or would be if we weren't in this pandemic. Because I believe that many kids are in the same space that they would be if we weren't here. It's just delivered differently, but I think that we have a lot of misconception in the public, and you know, those curriculum presentations we used to have at the board meeting, maybe we need to bring them back this spring and let the departments kind of advertise and promote their strategies to, you know, enlighten our public a little.
I think that's a great idea. I mean, one thing we have started to do, and I don't think it's quite the target you're shooting for, Joan, is the intermediate school did a several-minute kind of...
and I have heard great things about those, and those are also ways that we can let our public know. But maybe we need to do it on the more of the board level where we get this audience of, you know, our followers.
Yeah, and the middle school and high school are working on similar videos at this time. Eric Noah, Kyle Bratz, Becky Castle, Jason McConnell, Janine Ramsey, they're working. So you'll see something similar for those buildings, and that serves a purpose. But I do think, and again, we want to be sensitive to your time, but
Well, we
I think we are hopefully
time,
pivoting
too.
out of
This
crisis
is-
management
Right.
into.
Yeah, and maybe
They're already
it's something.
overworked, but
And maybe it's something we should bring up at the board retreat before we have, I just, some of the comments and some of the angst in both our staff and in our general public, I think is more of a misunderstanding of what you think you're going to be getting and what is being done, and they don't understand each other, and so we have, this discontent and conflict.
Yeah, I think, our we need to be sensitive of your time. Also want to be very sensitive of our teachers' time.
I do too.
They are working, but at the same time, our teachers are working extremely hard, extremely creatively. I think they have accomplished so much this year that I think, given the right amount of lead time and making sure we are tapping people who feel they have some space and time to be tapped, I think, again, we don't want to overburden people, but I also think we do probably owe it to them to
Absolutely.
showcase what they are providing. Now, and I would fully acknowledge that it's a different environment, whether it's high school or elementary, and there are some students who really struggle in this environment. We have kids who are really trying to work to try to re-engage and get caught up for a variety of reasons. We also have students who will tell us this is the best year of schooling they've had. Now, these are students who like the flexibility, or maybe there was some drama in the school that now they don't have to worry about at home. There's different reasons why it's a great experience for them. But we have kids who are not only feeling they're doing as well as they have done, there are kids who feel they're doing better than they have done. We are probably going to have a discussion, if we're going to be responsible stewards, about what do we want to provide in terms of remote learning options in 2021, 22, and beyond, because I do think we're not going to automatically snap back in all cases to where we are. I think we're going to have families that say, I like the different for my child. I want to keep access to that.
I think you're right.
So
Anyway.
maybe that needs to be, Brian?
Pop in here and speak. What we're doing now is so different than what parents ever experienced.
Yes.
And they have a window into it. They can see it. They see it happening. Their perception of what school was is based on 20 years ago. Let's just pick a high school kid, possibly or more. What happened 20 years in the high school doesn't happen that much anymore. That model of learning has long been gone, but they've not had the window into it.
the direction's strong.
They've not seen that we do, the majority of things we do are group work. The majority of things we do are interactive. Now they're seeing in, and the teacher's not standing there talking for 45 minutes, and they feel that it's less than what they got
Yes.
before.
Yep.
There's very few teachers in the high school that talk for more than 10 minutes. If you talk for 10 minutes, you've lost 90% of the class. And I would argue that that's not good teaching. It is get them started, give them some information, break them into groups, pull them back, have them talk out loud, and work through that. That's good instruction. That's what it is. That's what it's been the last many years. But now we have this window into this world that they're completely 100% unfamiliar with because it's unfamiliar. It is not, the experience that I had in high school is so vastly different than what is currently happening at the high school and probably at other levels. And that is a good thing. That is a fantastic thing. And teachers are doing unique things like flipping things. Just like Tim said, they flip it. Things are happening at home where they need to go through things. They come to class. Teacher might grab everybody, questions, get in your groups, and I'm going to bounce through those groups. What don't you understand, and connecting in. Where the teacher might not do any direct instruction in that Zoom meeting. So it is so vastly different than what I think any of us experienced in high school. Because it is, and it was. They just didn't realize how different it was. And now they have a window into it, and it's confusing to them. They're not sure, and it's not the same, because it can't be the same right now. But I'll echo what Tim is saying, the level of work that our teachers are currently doing just to make this entire experience happening is incredible. It's absolutely insane,
amazing.
the amount of work that they're doing. And I've heard those numbers thrown around at board meetings. They're getting 25 or 35%. Well, they're getting 150% effort. I will tell you that our staff are putting in endless hours to make this happen and make this work in this environment. But it is most for sure different than anything parents have ever seen, because it's been different.
And that's why, though, I think we both see the need to try
promote this.
to try to clarify that a little bit, a public service announcement type of thing at the board meeting, so there's a better understanding of what this all is. And listening to teachers again last night, and some of them, it's just what a tough stage they're on, because I remember back in the day, people would put a pot out in the hallway because they're being evaluated. They knew, they knew the principal was coming by that day. Well, these teachers are being evaluated every day by their community.
Mm-hmm.
And how's that for a peak performance? And yet they're doing an incredible job. But I think that's why how the clarity of what they're trying to do would be helpful. A vignette from the high school, a vignette from the middle school, a vignette from the elementary school. Just nothing to extend, but just enough to kind of give a sense of this is education today.
And I would also say that the skills that kids are learning today are going to be applicable their entire lives.
Mm-hmm.
We're looking, some people look at this as a deficit model. I'm looking at it as a growth
Oh, no,
model.
it's a growth.
And I think people need to hear those kind of things. Actually, when Sarah was speaking, and maybe I shouldn't even mention her name, but anyway, she said, her son didn't do well, and then he met with his teachers, and just that skill to take a poor position in his academic performance and figure out how to improve it. Those are lifelong skills, and that's going to gain him more than an A in a course.
Just the ability to navigate the technology,
Absolutely.
right? For our kids, this is the future. We can't be stuck in the past. Their office buildings are going to disappear. That's a fact. That process has started. You're going to have more and more kids. They're not falling behind. They're getting ahead. I truly feel that way. The schools that went back and did what they're going to do, they're doing. I want kids back. I get that, but our kids are going to have so many more skills for what is expected of them in the future, because they have navigated this, and some of them amazingly well. Some struggle. That's going to, that happens. But that our kids are having an experience unlike other schools and other places that is going to provide them an opportunity to be successful anywhere they go.
Good message, too. That's just a good message.
So we can think about how to profile that more in the future.
Great.
Thank you, Brian.
You're welcome.
Thank
Thanks,
you.
Brad.
Okay.
And I move we close.
Motion to adjourn.
So moved.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody.
Yeah.
Brian, thanks for being here. Amy, Tim, Randy, appreciate it.
I'll let the party with you go.
Oh, too bad.
How long did it take outside?
Half hour maybe.
That's good.
Yeah.
Is he the only one?
Are we done, Brian?
Yes.